This podcast contains our own personal views not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Coronial. My name is Emma.
I'm Georgie.
And I'm Alice.
So over the next 3 weeks, we will be taking a deep dive into the inquest into the deaths occurring as a result of the landslide at Thredbo Ski Village in 1997. This report was released in June 2000 and it's quite a lengthy one. The investigation into the incident and resulting deaths was lengthy. The evidence was dating back over 40 years from the time of the inquest. So there was a lot of evidence in this one considered by the coroner. So there's a lot of ground to cover with this inquest. So everyone sit back, relax, and we hope you enjoy the contents over the coming weeks.
Before we get started as well, did you guys read the coroner retired?
No.
During this?
Oh, really?
Yeah. So he was the state coroner at the time that Thredbo happened.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a bit around, he was there and made some statements like at the time, at the event, etc.
Yeah.
Because there was a bit of kerfuffle or poor communication around the fact that all the victims needed autopsies because they were kind of like, why?
We know how they died.
Yeah, and they wanted them released in terms of for planning and all, for funerals and stuff. And so, yeah, at the very end, he sort of said, you know, I was the coroner there. I should have communicated that better. But then also there's been that consistency throughout that I've been the same coroner dealing with this throughout, even through the fact that I have now essentially retired through ill health. Oh. And so, yeah, he became ill soon before this was published and made available. The findings were made public and so then retired after.
Everyone obviously knows about this incident, but the reason I chose this inquest is because I read his biography.
Oh, okay.
And he mentions in there...
The coroner's biography?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, he said that this inquest, because he thought it was so significant, it was one of the first to be published on the internet.
Oh.
Wow.
At least in Australia.
Oh, okay.
At that time, because of course, I mean, now a lot of inquests have been published retrospectively that are older than this.
True,
yes.
true.
But yeah, he
at
thought
the
this
time,
one was important enough, public enough, I guess, that he thought that it should be published.
Yeah, wow.
For many people to read.
Which is so interesting because I must admit, I had actually not heard of the Thredbo landslide.
Oh, really?
Prior. No, I had not.
It was kind of like in my mind, but I didn't know anything about it. So it was really interesting to learn about for me, like from that perspective. Also touching on the fact that it is historical, the bit that I really enjoyed that I think we've talked about in the Alice Springs one was they had to phone people on the landline.
Yeah.
Yep.
And there's some comments in my section where it's like, yes, and then they were called at home and I was like, right, because mobiles didn't exist then.
Yeah, you couldn't just answer the phone wherever you were.
Yeah.
You had to be at home to receive calls.
Yeah. So anyway.
Which is it's an interesting concept. So starting off with today's episode, we'll be giving an overview of the events of the landslide, the conditions of the road which caused the landslide, and we'll give you a bit of history regarding the ownership of the area and previous landslides which occurred prior to the fatal night in 1997. So starting off with the events of the Thredbo landslide. So at approximately 11:30 p.m. on the night of the 30th of July 1997, there was a landslide at Thredbo Village in Kosciuszko National Park in the Snowy Mountains region of southern New South Wales. So Thredbo is a popular village ski resort in Australia, and when the mountain is covered by snow, it has the longest ski runs in Australia, which I did not know.
Yeah, neither.
It is built in the valley of the Thredbo River and is accessible by a road called the Alpine Way. It currently has a permanent population of just under 500 people, but attracts approximately 700,000 visitors annually.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Which I also didn't realise. That's current statistics.
True.
I'm not sure what it was like back in the late 90s, but I understand it's always been quite a popular place to visit.
Yeah, it is the, one of very few main snowing and skiing areas in Australia. We don't have a lot of ski areas. Thredbo is one of the main ones.
Yeah. So the Alpine Way is a road which sits above the village of Thredbo, connecting the village to the nearby towns of Cooma and Carncoban to the east and to the west of Thredbo village, respectively. On the night of the 30th of July 1997, earth and mud began to slide from the fill embankment of the Alpine Way above Thredbo Ski Village. In a matter of seconds, the landslide material impacted the east wing of Corinna Ski Lodge, tearing the lodge in two. The east wing of the lodge joined the landslide and continued to move in a northeast direction down the hill. There was one occupant of the Corinna Ski Lodge that night who passed away as a result of the landslide. The landslide then continued, impacting the fill embankment of the Alpine Way, causing the area of impact to collapse. This caused a second movement of the landslide, causing it to move in a northwesterly direction when it directly impacted the west wing of Corinna, shearing the lodge from its foundations. The west wing of Corinna, including the impacted soil and superstructure, then projected down the slope across Beaubuck Lane, which was a street in Thredbo Village. The landslide collided with the western end of Bimbadeen, which was another ski lodge, causing it to collapse and pushing the building in a clockwise position. 18 people were in Bimbadeen Lodge at the time. Of those 18 people, 17 were killed.
Yeah. It's the biggest landslide and fatalities that we've had in Australia.
It's interesting because the coroner actually noted in the report that it was the biggest fatality count by natural disaster in Australia, but then I Googled that and we've definitely had bushfires even prior to 1997, which caused, higher. Yeah, but it's a different type of natural disaster, but I was still like, that's not technically correct because a bushfire is a natural disaster. So a rescue operation commenced immediately. One survivor, Stuart Diver, was located in the rubble on the 2nd of August. At the time of rescue, he had been trapped for 65 hours.
That's a long time.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was actually, because I watched a news report of this, like a contemporaneous news report, and he was actually next to his wife.
Yeah.
Yeah,
wow.
So he was next to his wife at the time, and they'd both been pinned down, obviously, by the rubble, and his wife had been pinned down into an area that was filling up with water, and so she eventually drowned because of that, and he was, lying in the rubble next to them.
That's horrible.
And then apparently later on, just one of those guys who unfortunately has a lot of bad luck, he remarried, and then his second wife unfortunately passed away from breast cancer quite young.
So once they found him, it took them a further 12 hours to actually get him out as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oof.
So he was found at 8 a.m. in the morning, and it wasn't until 8 p.m. at night that they managed to actually free him from that spot as well. Can you imagine once someone finally finds you, then not like still having to wait?
Yeah,
and how terrifying that would have been as well.
Yeah, because I understand like the part that he was in as well, trapped in, was also filling up with water. Like he would have been cold. When daylight broke on the 31st of July 97, there were a number of issues apparent relating to the geological and urban environment in which the landslide occurred. So, of particular note, the landslide scarp, which is the pathway the landslide followed, so basically like the scar of the landslide, it was substantially dry except for the southwest corner where the landslide had started, and in the middle of that wet area, there was a fractured water main pipe.
Yeah.
We will get to this.
Foreshadowing that.
Yeah. On the opposite side of the Alpine Way, running the full length of the landslide scarp and beyond, was a retaining wall, which had been constructed by the National Parks and Wildlife Service in February and March of 1997, which was just 4 months before the landslide. In seeking to identify the cause of death, the coroner considered a number of things, of course, particularly the construction and maintenance of the Alpine Way, the development of the Thredbo village immediately adjacent to the Alpine Way, the construction of Corinna Lodge, the design, approval and construction of the water main, and the design, approval and construction of the retaining wall. So first of all, we're going to introduce the Alpine Way and talk a little bit about that. So the Alpine Way was built by the Snowy Mountains Hydroelectric Authority in the 1950s in order to connect the town of Kumar with Kankaban to assist with construction as part of the Snowy Mountains scheme. The Snowy Mountains scheme was a hydroelectric engineering scheme where the water of the Snowy River, which ordinarily flowed into the river flats of East Gippsland and then into the Bass Strait, it was diverted instead to flow inland into the Murray and Murrumbidgee irrigation areas. So obviously it was previously flowing out into the ocean.
Yep.
And so they decided to develop this scheme to divert the water, so it was more useful for inland use. So as part of the Snowy Mountains scheme, a number of dams, power stations and plumbing stations, as well as 225 kilometres of pipelines, tunnels and aqueducts were constructed in the Snowy Mountains between 1949 and 1974. In building the Alpine Way, the Snowy Mountains Hydroelectric Authority, which we'll now refer to as the Snowy Mountains Authority, recognised that the terrain was extremely difficult for road building, and in building the road, they only ever intended it to be used for light vehicle traffic. Mm-hmm. According to the Snowy Mountains Authority, the Alpine Way was constructed to a Class A standard, which was their highest standard at the time. However, it was never intended to be a main public highway, but rather as a construction road. So it was designed with the intention to last for about 20 years.
But hang on, designed as a construction road, but yet it was only meant to have light vehicles on it?
When they say that, they mean it's more so like it's not meant to be a main thoroughfare, like a...
Yeah, it's not meant to have frequent traffic.
So basically the road was built for the purpose of then allowing them to construct the infrastructure needed for the Snowy Mountain scheme.
Yeah.
And then after that was completed, then it wasn't meant to be used anymore.
As a continued road use.
In 1968, the road was acquired by the New South Wales government for permanent use as a vehicle thoroughfare. So despite the fact that it was only ever intended to be used for that purpose, it was then later acquired in the late 60s by New South Wales
and foreshadowing here, but one would have thought that they might have done their due diligence around what the road was designed for in the first place. But
you would hope so.
So the road itself was built on a high plateau and along a very steeply sloping mountain and gully slides. This required the use of side cutting to support the road, which was both costly and liable to slipping. Due to the cost, very little of the side cutting was used, and instead, in many places, the road's edge was supported by logs of timber. In 1974, these logs were reported as beginning to rot, and it was assumed that slips would occur more frequently in the road.
All of that sounds horrible.
Doesn't sound great.
What? And everyone was just cool with this?
Yeah, who thought that was a good idea?
Yeah.
Well, again, in the 1950s when it was built, they weren't expecting that it would be
still maintained at
past 1974.
Fair.
In 1991, a consulting firm undertook an evaluation of the benefits of upgrading the Alpine Way. Again, early 90s. This was built in the 50s.
Yeah, wow.
Evaluation of the benefits of upgrading the Alpine Way, observing that slippages along the road appeared to result from the nature of the original construction. The report recorded land slippage was evident along the Alpine Way, especially adjacent to the Thredbo village, and recommended remedial action be taken to reduce the danger of a slippage at Thredbo, which may cause extensive damage or death. So this was written down in writing in a report in 1991. So what's that?
40 years after the road was constructed that was designed to last for 20 years.
Correct. And then 6 years, subsequently 6 years before the landslide.
Yeah, wow.
The Alpine Way extends for around 1.3 kilometres above Thredbo village, and despite the expressed concerns, it was never reconstructed to improve the original construction prior to the 1997 landslide.
That's
in that area.
Yeah.
As mentioned, on the 1st of April 1968, the responsibility for the maintenance and the snow clearing of the roads constructed by the Snowy Mountains Authority fell to the New South Wales government. The National Parks and Wildlife Service was responsible for the care and management of the roads within the park. At this time, the Department of Main Roads agreed to act as an agent for the National Parks and Wildlife Service in undertaking snow clearance and maintenance of the road on a priority basis. So it was open for the state government to declare the Alpine Way to be a main road or another described road, which would have brought the Alpine Way under the control of the Road Traffic Authority, meaning the Road Traffic Authority, or we'll call them the RTA, would be directly responsible for the maintenance and construction works of the Alpine Way. This would mean that state funds would have been available for its maintenance and reconstruction.
But they chose not to?
It was not proclaimed, so the only funds available for its maintenance was from annual funds for rural local roads provided by the federal government. So basically, if they did declare it a main road, it would have had a lot more funding available to it. But as it was, they didn't declare it.
Okay.
So there was very little funding available. The Alpine Way was not proclaimed a main road prior to the landslide. I believe it has
It was obviously reconstructed after as well.
And
so
therefore
I would say
it has been proclaimed since then.
Yeah.
However, prior to the landslide, numerous attempts were made for the RTA to take control of the road, all which failed.
Yep.
That's frustrating.
Yeah. So we'll now talk a little bit about what the historical understanding of the landslide risk in the Thredbo area was. So there's been a history of known landslide problems in association with human development in hilly areas. I think that's quite well known.
And I mean, for me, landslides are not common in Australia, obviously very common in some parts of the world, right? And I didn't realise, so I did some searching around, well, how common is it actually in Australia? So I found some handout by some geotechnical engineers. But yeah, definitely along the coasts of Australia, it actually is far more common than I would have thought, but presumably smaller, less fatalities in unoccupied areas and that kind of thing.
Yeah. As early as 1890, there have been reports of landslide concerns along the Illawarra Way, with detailed studies in that area conducted by the New South Wales Geological Survey in 1951 and 1958. In a report from those studies, it was concluded that in determining whether the foundations for our roads and railways are safe or unstable depends on the nature of the underlying rock formations. Issues with landslides in eastern Australia during the 1970s led to the production of instability zoning maps for the affected areas. So there are actually areas of Australia that are specifically zoned as being landslide risks as well. And I think you potentially cannot construct in those areas. I think that was mostly in the Tamar Valley of Tasmania.
Okay.
So up to the point of the inquest, there had been no systematic recording of landslides along the Alpine Way. However, the coroner was able to piece together a comprehensive history of the recorded landslides along the Alpine Way from its construction to July 1997, in which he wrote down 10 landslides in total. Despite this history of landslides, there was little to no appreciation of the risk of those landslides and what they might pose to Thredbo village.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, not really thought about so much in that context. The coroner considered several earlier landslides in the report, starting with the Winterhouse landslide. So just a little bit of background on that. The Winterhouse landslide was the first recorded landslide associated with the Alpine Way, and that occurred in 1964. It happened adjacent to the Winterhouse Lodge in Thredbo village, but it did not impact a lodge or building. It involved the sudden slump of an outer segment of the fill on the Alpine Way above the Winterhouse Lodge through a vertical distance of about 6 feet. The slump led to a further vertical displacement, which occurred slowly over a 3-day period, and then a mud flow commenced down the slope. So prior to the landslide, there were cracks in the pavement of the Alpine Way adjacent to the slide area. So there were obviously some sort of land movements going on there that were indicative of a potential slip about to occur.
Yep.
The landslide was investigated and it was concluded that it occurred as a result of complete saturation of an uncompacted and differentially settling fill of completely weathered granite.
But essentially it's just dirt that got wet. That became mud and so therefore sank, because when you dampen the uncompacted dirt,
it just slides basically.
Yeah,
it'll slide, but also mud and just slides.
I want to say it becomes smaller, but it's not. It just becomes more compact.
Yeah. So it was concluded that there would be no danger to life or property provided that there was adequate treatment of the landslide area.
I love that. There will be no danger so long as you fix it.
Just as long as you fix it. That is a theme.
Yes.
It's like we recognise the risk, fix it, but then it doesn't get fixed.
Yep. Yeah, true.
There were otherwise no documents showing any contemporaneous records of the Winterhouse landslide, and no one else engaged in work in the Thredbo area in the mid-1960s could recall that landslide.
As in they just ignored that it happened,
or that people who knew about it had left.
Yeah.
So despite this, the scar from the Winterhouse landslide was still visible in 1997. So it definitely happened.
Yeah. It just wasn't necessarily recorded.
How is it still visible? Things didn't overgrow it?
Obviously not.
I think it's potentially too rocky and steep for anything big to grow. There's not going to be a tree there.
It's granite. Yeah. Okay. Yep.
So shortly after New South Wales took responsibility for the park roads, the Department of Main Roads did an inspection which revealed a location overlooking Thredbo village where the road was at risk of slipping down onto the village. The Department of Main Roads resisted taking responsibility of the Alpine Way as it was of the view that it was not suitable as a state highway and it would need a great deal of investment to make the roads suitable for tourist use.
Even though it was already
being used for tourist use, but that was sort of like
such a cop-out where they're like, it's too unsafe to be a main road, but it's being utilised as a main road.
So we're just not going to say that it's a main road so we don't have any liability.
Exactly, so we don't have to take responsibility of it. And we don't want to take responsibility of it too because it's going to cost a lot.
If you're going to have that argument, at least then also as the authority come along and say this should no longer be used as what is essentially a main road. It was continually being used by tourists.
But the issue is otherwise there would be no access to Thredbo.
Agreed. And so people are going to get upset. But they should have at least used their authority to maintain safety, even if they couldn't actually
But then they should have taken over.
Yeah.
I don't think they could say, you need to fix this, but we're not going to do anything about it.
Because it's not under our jurisdiction.
It's not a solution, but they should have used power.
Yeah.
Again, it doesn't make a solution, but if you're going to say it's unsafe so we won't fix it because we don't want to have to, it doesn't mean you can just walk away and be like,
it's not our responsibility because it's someone else's responsibility.
Yeah.
This is the whole issue.
And I mean, I think it's something that we come across a lot where safety is often just like, well, I don't want to have to deal with it, so I won't. But safety.
Yeah.
Do you not feel guilty at night that you've just left an unsafe problem?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that really summarises that this was the key issue that confronted each of the respective caretakers of the Alpine Road. So the standard of the construction of the road was below what was generally required for carrying similar traffic volumes. It had substandard foundations, poor construction, poor alignment, ineffective drainage, and excessively steep and winding sections. And as we've said before, this is because it was originally built for a different purpose.
Yeah. So you can't necessarily blame the construction.
No,
because it was never built for this purpose.
Yeah. So you're not saying that they are negligent in terms of their construction of it. Because, again, from the bit that I was coming from, I was like, oh, who designed this? But now having that extra bit of information, it's like, okay, they designed this for an entirely different purpose.
Yeah, that's right.
It was fit for purpose at the time it was
exactly, and for the length of time that it was meant to be. But beyond that, it's sort of like, well, it should have stopped being used or it should have been properly reconstructed.
Yeah.
So when the National Parks and Wildlife Service took over responsibility for the roads, it requested maintenance to the Alpine Way be a priority. So the National Parks and Wildlife Service itself, however, had limited funds to maintain the roads. It's all a money issue.
Why? What was their primary reason for taking over the road as the authority for it?
I think that was just because all roads fell within the Kosciuszko National Park. I think they just automatically became responsible for all roads within a national park area. So it kind of fell under their jurisdiction. So obviously New South Wales government, and then they assigned the roads that were within
that area,
the jurisdiction of any national parks.
It's not like they came along and were like, this is ours now.
Yeah. And again, I think the New South Wales government also inherited it because it was obviously fell under the jurisdiction of the Snowy Mountain Authority at the time, but that was only a limited scheme.
Yeah.
That expired and hadn't expired after time. And then once that expired, it's like, well, it's in the jurisdiction of New South Wales.
Yeah.
So then it automatically falls to the state government, and the state government has been like, yeah, well, it's within a national park.
So it falls under
So it falls under the national park.
Yep. Okay.
They didn't take it. No, they weren't like putting their hand up for it and saying, I want this.
Okay.
In 1969, the owner of Tyrola Lodge, which was a lodge in Thredbo village, wrote to the National Park and Wildlife Service reporting concerns of the position of a number of granite boulders embedded in the fill batter of the Alpine Way near the lodge. They reported that up to 20 boulders were partially embedded or resting upon detritus of granite, sand, and there was a possible risk of a slip or a rockfall from it. So obviously they've got their lodge that they own, and there's some dodgy looking fill next to the Alpine Way that looks like it could potentially fall. And so they reported it.
Seems fair.
Seems logical. So it wasn't clear what, if anything, was done in the interim, but by 1971, remember this report was made in 1969.
Yeah.
By 1971, the National Park and Wildlife Service informs the owner of Tyrola Lodge that it was not prepared to undertake any work on the road batter, but the owner could, at their own expense and responsibility, erected a retaining wall at the bottom of the batter to prevent any loose material rolling into the walls of the lodge.
Wow.
So again, they're basically like, sorry, we're not going to upgrade it, but if you want to do something about it and assume the risk.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking of like, but then how do you even construct that retaining wall if you think that the land is unstable? Like,
well, I know.
I have so many questions.
You'd need to get an engineering company to
Exactly.
come and do it for you.
Sure. This is your problem now.
Yeah. If you're concerned, do something about it.
And that's the thing, it probably costs them more to construct the retaining wall than it would to keep the lodge running
Yeah.
than what the profit they're actually making from the lodge.
Obviously that lodge stayed.
I assume so.
I wonder if that makes you liable had that lodge actually been part of it because you knew it was a problem.
Well, I don't think they're liable in any way in terms of the 97 landslide, but if they had built a retaining wall, you're potentially putting yourself at risk because that could be your dodgy construction.
But if you knew that there was a risk of a landslide and didn't build the retaining wall.
They reported it to the right authorities.
They didn't ignore it.
Yeah, they didn't ignore it.
But they also continued to let people stay in their lodge even though they knew that there was a risk that the mountain could just fall over onto it at any point.
Like, yes, but if the National Parks and Wildlife Service...
Don't think it's enough of a problem.
Yeah, like if they're saying, no, we're not going to do anything about it because clearly we don't see fit.
Yeah.
You can do it if you want.
Yeah.
I don't think that falls on
the
owner of that lodge.
I don't know the law around it, but that's sort of a precarious thing. I think they would consider like you had knowledge of it, but it's the whole knowledge and intent sort of thing.
True.
In terms of negligence.
Yeah, fair.
The knowledge was there, but they genuinely took steps to act. It may have just been completely, and I'm sure it was, just completely beyond their financial capacity to be able to do something like that.
Well, I mean, it was beyond the financial capacity of the Parks and Wildlife
And at the end of the
Service.
day, it's public property, that it's not their property.
Yeah.
And clearly the whole of the length of it needed to be... It wasn't just that one section.
They were obviously just concerned about that one section because it was above their lodge. But yeah, and that wasn't even the part that ended up slipping.
Yeah, true.
So, you know, it's just sort of saying that this was a bigger issue than even just the slip.
Yeah.
So after this report, it appears that no action was ever taken to rectify that particular concern from either the National Parks and Wildlife Service or the owner of Tyrrell Lodge.
Yep.
That said, there were officers at the National Parks Wildlife Service that remained concerned about the safety of the village. In particular, officers noted concerns about the area between the Thredbo Ranger Station, the Thredbo Village, and Dead Horse Gap, which was particularly prone to road slip.
I'm sorry, hang on. Dead Horse Gap?
I'm sure when they named it, there was a horse that died there.
Yeah, and is that legitimately someone being super lazy on naming?
Yes.
Yeah, there was one part where they were talking about, this guy's office, and it was located at Waste Point, like Waste.
Yep.
I was like, could have they not come up with a nicer name? Above Thredbo Village, it was observed that the cut and fill batters were potentially subject to landslip. It was all observed.
Yeah, everyone,
Yeah.
A lot of people knew about the issues.
Exactly. This is pretty much all I'm talking about, is that there was so many points in time where things were raised and nothing was done about it. So the most significant landslide of the 1970s occurred in 1978 when a length of approximately 50 metres of the Alpine Way slipped 200 metres into the Thredbo River, completely closing off the road. So this wasn't in Thredbo Village, but it was still along the Alpine Way.
Yep.
It occurred approximately 3 kilometres east of the village. The village was isolated from traffic to the east for a number of weeks while the road was repaired.
Oh, gee, I will have to ski for longer.
They just have to go the other way. There is actually no formal document claiming to identify the cause of this particular landslide, but the Department of Main Roads engineer reported that the slip uncovered a large number of springs flowing in all directions in that part of the failed road.
So again, is there that assumption that water got into dry area?
Yeah.
It sunk, it became muddy, and it just slipped away.
Yeah, and there was also heavy rainfalls in the week before the slip, so the springs were flowing because of the heavy rainfall. So water was involved.
Yeah.
In its evidence, the National Park and Wildlife Service accepted that by 1978, information was available to all bodies and persons with an interest in the Alpine Way that it was prone to landslips and required reconstruction.
And yet nothing was done.
Yes. So now I'm just going to touch a little bit on the relationship between the National Parks Wildlife Service and the Department of Main Roads. So the National Parks and Wildlife Service submitted to the coroner that the Department of Main Roads and then later the Road Traffic Authority was in control of determining the priorities for the reconstruction of the Alpine Way. So MPWS was basically saying it's the Department of Main Roads' responsibility to work out. And the Department of Main Roads submitted that due to the legal arrangement between it and National Parks and Wildlife Service, it did what it was instructed to do by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So in other words, it was up to the National Parks Wildlife Service to determine what should be done with the roads.
Yeah, and they determined you should do something about it, and then you elected not to do anything about it.
But also no one decided to do anything about it.
No one really decided to do anything about it because they were both just telling each other to do it.
And no one took responsibility.
Then there was no funding.
But it sounds like the Road Traffic Authority were like, we did exactly what the Parks and Wildlife said, but the Parks and Wildlife said, road traffic, you need to do something about this.
Well, they didn't really. They sort of said there's issues, but we don't have the funds.
Yeah, true.
And they asked them to take it over, but Department of Main Roads said
Yeah,
no.
but then they didn't declare it a main road, so...
Yeah.
And that's true because the Department of Main Roads is the Department of Main Roads and it's not a main road. So the coroner set out evidence presented by both sides in support of those particular submissions. In conclusion, the coroner noted that he was left with the overwhelming impression that the problem of the cost of maintenance, let alone the reconstruction of the park roads, burdened the officers of both the National Parks and Wildlife Service and the Department of Main Roads from the time that the National Parks and Wildlife Service assumed responsibility for those roads. So basically, everyone knew that there was an issue. Everyone was concerned about it. But there was no money. So this particular burden impression was particularly relevant in relation to the Alpine Way because obviously we're talking about all the roads because the National Parks and Wildlife Service assumed responsibility for all the roads.
Within that area.
Yeah. You know, this particular concern was especially prevalent for the Alpine Way. It's likely for that reason that over a 10-year period ending in 1989, the Alpine Way leading up to the village was reconstructed and the road beyond the village to Dead Horse Gap was also the subject of the Department of Main Roads works in the 1970s. So basically, they reconstructed parts of the road to the east of Thredbo village and to the west.
But not the
stretch above.
The populated bit.
Yeah.
Cool.
Excellent.
Yeah. So the coroner was troubled by evidence that the concerns on the part of the Departments of Main Road in relation to the state of the Alpine Way do not appear to have been communicated adequately to the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So there's also communication issues between the railways, which is, super surprising. This is all the more relevant following the landslides that occurred in the 1970s. The coroner was of the opinion that the Department of Main Roads should have expressly warned the National Parks and Wildlife Services of the landslide risk of the Alpine Way near and in Thredbo village.
Weren't the National Parks and Wildlife aware of the risk anyway?
They should have been.
Didn't they argue to the RTA that they would like them to fix the main road that they claimed wasn't a main road in the first place?
Supposedly, but supposedly they also hadn't had express warning about it.
Oh, that's such a flawed argument.
Yep.
Yeah.
Not only is no one wanting to take responsibility, they're now also backtracking and being like, oh no, but we didn't know.
It's not, or we
or
didn't know the extent.
Yeah.
We didn't know how bad it was. It's a complete mess.
Absolutely.
An absolute mess. So in 1988, the arrangement between the National Parks and Wildlife Service and the Department of Main Roads ceased when the funding arrangement, which was made in 1968, expired. So it obviously had, a 20-year arrangement in place. So at this time, the National Parks and Wildlife Service reached a 5-year arrangement with the Snowy River Shire Council, or the SRSC, to undertake various programs of work as directed by the National Parks Wildlife Service. The agreement was extended in 1993 to expire in 1996. For all of this time, the SRSC undertook virtually all maintenance of the Alpine Way. The coroner referred to this period as the Bright period, after the engineer who was responsible for managing the arrangement.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. I thought it meant like this was the golden era.
Just Mr. Bright was in charge. So during the Bright period, it was consistently noted that the 1.3 kilometres of the Alpine Way above Thredbo village was in generally poor condition and requiring remedial works, as it did not appear to have ever had any substantial reconstruction works undertaken on it since the time that it was built in 1950 for the purpose of being a construction road to last 20 years. This is a 1988 now.
Yeah.
So we're moving along.
But again, with the road that wasn't constructed to still be here at this point.
Exactly.
It's still here at this point and we are still worried that it won't be soon.
Yeah, but we're not doing anything about it. In 1989, another landslide occurred on the Alpine Way 2 kilometres east of Thredbo. The slide was approximately 20 metres wide and extended from the shoulder of the Alpine Way approximately 200 metres downhill to the Thredbo River.
Hang on, but is this the section that the RTA had done up when you said that they did the east and the west?
I'm not sure if they quite did it because this is only 2 kilometres to the side, so they might have not
got that close.
There.
Okay.
About 2,000 cubic metres of material slipped in that landslide. So that seems like a lot.
Yeah.
That does, but I don't know how to
quantify that in my mind.
But also
neither, yeah.
20 metres wide. Like, I can picture that.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's like
that's pretty wide.
Not quite a tennis court.
And 200 metres.
2/3 of a tennis court. Okay. Why do I measure things in tennis courts?
I'm not sure. I measured them in meters.
Yeah, but I don't know how big a meter is unless I quantify it by like something that's a meter, right?
Makes sense.
Yeah, anyway.
When the landslide area was being repaired, it was discovered that water from an under-road culvert had been discharged into the fuel batter, saturating it, so it was a potential slip zone.
More water.
More water. In 1990, Mr. Bright forwarded proposals for the 1990-1991 road maintenance plan for the Alpine Way. So there was a plan.
Excellent.
In that plan, he outlined his concerns to the National Park and Wildlife Service about possible slips along the road. On this occasion, Mr. Bright's concerns got some response, and the director of the National Park and Wildlife Service asked that a full investigation of potential problems be undertaken. This memorandum of request was sent to the road's foreman, who concluded from the memorandum that the issue was being dealt with as a policy issue and therefore no action was required.
I'm expressly concerned. So we should make a plan. Cool, let's make a policy. Okay, policy is being made.
It sounds like that was misinterpreted by the foreman, potentially because of the language that was used.
Misinterpreted. Where it was like, let's make this someone else's problem.
Yep.
But the coroner concluded that with the communications from Mr. Bright regarding the state of the Alpine Way, the National Parks and Wildlife Service would have been under no doubt that the state of the road above Thredbo may be subject to slides and was no safer than anywhere else along the length of the road. So he's again reiterating that he said this about, in 1978. By that time, everyone was aware. And now again in 1990, everyone is aware. 12 years later?
Yeah.
There might have been some change of staff in that period of time.
Yeah, but still same concerns about the state of the road and nothing's been done.
Yeah.
From 1991, the Road Traffic Authority assumed the role of technical advisor for the Alpine Way. By May of 1991, a substantial increase in funding had been secured by the Road Traffic Authority to fix issues along the Alpine Way. Woohoo!
Are they finally claiming it as a main road?
No. They never did that until past the landslide. During the next 5 years, much of the funding was spent reconstructing and sealing the Alpine Way from a point west of the village, further westward towards Carncoban.
Basically not the bit that...
Not the bit that was concerned.
Yeah. I mean, that was all concerning, but...
Yeah, but this bit... yeah.
Again, with not the bit that had a as far as I'm aware, I don't know what's adjacent to Thredbo, but we're saying not the bit that had a population directly below
basically.
it.
Yeah.
No, so I don't think there's any population apart from Thredbo between those two villages.
Yeah, so all good. They're trying to stop people from just like falling off a cliff when they're driving there, but it's not picking up the concern where it'll fall into a populated area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as we're saying, this obviously raised questions about the prioritisation of expenditure as the funding was not used to repair the Alpine Way above Thredbo village.
Yeah, which it should have been done as a priority.
And again, we do have to emphasise the hindsight is obviously playing a big factor here.
Yeah, but I feel like there's been so many little slips along the area that like hindsight is
still
becoming
not enough. Yeah.
In short, there were issues along the whole of the Alpine Way. The western sector of the road at that point in time was unsealed, whereas the eastern sector, including Thredbo, was sealed. So geotechnical advice, which was obtained by the Road Traffic Authority, was sought, and the recommendation was to attend to the upgrading and sealing of the western end of the road. So there was prioritisation put in place.
Okay.
Whole road was shit. Part of it was unsealed, part of it was sealed.
But does adding more weight to something that's about to fall off of the side of a cliff by sealing it make it better?
No, not necessarily.
Not necessarily, but it makes the drive nicer.
Helpful.
Except when you fall.
It may or may not involve going down the cliff quicker than you planned.
But up until that point, smoother.
Again, assume if an engineer is designing the ceiling of it, then in theory they're making it appropriate. But I don't know if it doesn't seem like the obvious priority to me if the concern is it falling off the cliff, that putting a seal on it just creates more weight.
That is what they decided. And it seemed, according to the coroner, the sensible thing to do. So
Okay. Cool.
So the RTA undertook a number of inspections throughout the early to mid-1990s on the Alpine Way. This included the installation of 2 inclinometers on the Alpine Way above Thredbo to measure any land movements. So these instruments were read once annually.
That's not enough.
Well, it depends on where you're putting them. Obviously, that might be enough if the land's not moving that much.
Yeah, but it is.
Yeah.
But to be fair, in all of these annual readings, none indicated any concerns for any landslide risk.
That's interesting. Does that mean that they either weren't working or that the land was stable?
Or that the time that they measured it
was stable.
Yeah. And or just like the one annual reading that they read, it was stable at that point in time.
Because I would have expected there to be a significant shift if there was ongoing movement.
But I think potentially it was only a millimetre in those annual readings. It's not until it failed that it
becomes a problem.
Like,
yeah, fair.
In May 1996, 14 months before the landslide, in summarising the last inclinometer readings before the event, it was reported that there was no significant movement in the instruments above Thredbo. So the last reading
was fine.
Okay.
Mm.
In August of 96, there were 2 road failures well east of Thredbo village. Both were caused by drainage problems. Surprise, surprise.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. This did not trigger the need for reassessment of the Thredbo area. This despite being noted in reports that the presence of water in the fill area affected stability. None of the reports drew any attention to the presence of the Alpine Way water main. So basically, there were drainage issues that caused this other landslide, but in no way were any reports sort of concerned about the water main that was at Thredbo village.
Was that the same water main extending that far? Because you said it was
I'm not sure if it was the same water main.
They should have put 2 and 2
they
together.
Should have, by
water
this
main
point started to put the number of landslides that were
Yep.
caused by drainage issues and springs and
Okay.
water and things like that. It didn't just trigger in their minds at all that, oh, hey, there's a water main.
And if they had a registry of noting down all of these things that you could look at and you could see the trend, etc.
The trends that's going on. So the RTA had developed a system of slope risk assessment, which was an assessment used to determine how to prioritise geotechnical investigations, preventative and or remedial work. The system operated in 2 stages. The first involved the completion of a standard form that specified the features of slope stability. The second involved the completion of a slope instability score sheet by a geotechnical specialist conducting an on-site visual assessment and scoring slope instability features. The instability classification could be ranked as one of 5 stages, ranging from very high to very low. For the slope affected by the 1997 landslide, in a measurement taken sometime before the incident, the instability risk was rated as high, and it was recommended that action to rectify the instability issues be undertaken as soon as possible.
Excellent. And I just don't understand how things like that don't trigger you cannot use this road until that is rectified.
You cannot have anybody in Thredbo.
Yeah.
The knock-on effect of that would be quite devastating, though.
Yeah,
it would be
financially tourism.
Devastating for that area. So it's really
hard to make that call. I agree, because they weren't expecting then a human fatality to be so devastating. You know, I get that the expectation wasn't that, but when it comes to things like that, where it's there is such a high risk of this happening, the fact that didn't trigger any significant action or response, because the moment you then cut off people getting into Thredbo, things will probably get fixed pretty quickly, won't they?
Yeah.
You know, because it's going to disrupt people's lives.
Economy.
Yeah.
And the economy of that area. So someone is going to be well, we got to get this fixed.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do we know how long it took them to rebuild the road after the 97 landslide?
It didn't actually tell me specific.
I'm just wondering,
time frame.
After the worst had happened, how quickly were they actually able to get it done?
And the problem is that they had to do the investigation first before they could do any. So I don't think that time frame would represent what time frame might have actually happened, because there was a significant delay just in the clearing of the debris in the first place.
Mm.
Versus if you could just repair it by just bringing trucks in straight away as well.
Yeah, it would have been
versus
a lot quicker.
instability of the ground even further so after the landslide.
So yeah, that is where we're going to leave today's episode. Basically, there was several issues in the sort of 40 years prior.
All hinted to the possibility of a devastating landslide happening.
Exactly right. There were a number of ownerships and responsibilities over the area. They were all aware that there was a massive slip risk, especially above Thredbo village. There were a number of reconstructions of the road done.
But none in the area.
None in the area above the populated area, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And, you know, the last report done prior to the 1997 landslide said that the area above Thredbo village was at high risk of having a landslide and that something needed to be done about it as soon as possible. But as with all the other previous reports prior to that,
nothing ever was.
Nothing was done.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so that's where we'll leave it today. But please join us next week where we will discuss the development of Thredbo village and the construction of the Alpine Way water main and retaining wall. Thanks for joining us and we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.